Om Shanti and hello to everyone. I've been asked to share something of my experience of how I got to really know the divine. I got to know God and develop a beautiful relationship with God. And I feel so fortunate that that has happened in my life. When I was brought up, I was really brought up with the Old Testament, mostly the Old Testament of the Bible. And in that, God is often shown as, quite vengeful and even angry. But yet, somehow, internally, I always felt that God was a God of love. I always felt a loving presence. And when I got older, in my later teenage years, I really began to search. I wanted to know God more deeply. And I went to spiritual communities. I studied the Kabbalah, which is the esoteric teaching of Judaism. And, I just loved the mystery of it all. I was very enchanted by the thought that somehow I could go beyond what I could just see in this world and experience the divine. And it was actually then one afternoon in Edinburgh, myself and my husband David, we were there on holiday, and you know how things happen. We were handed a leaflet to an exhibition about Raj Yoga. And so we went along and got to know something of the teachings of Raj Yoga. And that's where, for the first time, I was introduced to the idea that God could have a form. Otherwise, I thought God was formless. But the idea of the divine being a point, a source of divine energy, unlimited, and yet a point source. And that for the soul, the being, I am also a point. And in fact, it makes sense because a point is very, very powerful, very subtle, and yet can emanate a huge energy field. And somehow, hearing that, something opened up in my own consciousness, and I felt as if I was gaining or experiencing that flow of divine energy. And I really experienced that as God's love. It was a loving energy. Because before I used to say a mantra, and I would do my mantra very, disciplined way for 20 minutes in the morning, 20 minutes in the evening. But even then, I just after that want to sit with God. And so here was this opportunity to really feel God's love flowing to the soul. And I think because I had that feeling of faith, it was possible for that consciousness to open and for that to be possible. And sometimes when people are starting to think about meditating or connecting with the divine, I would say, well, look, just take a leap of faith, just for the moment. Your doubts can sit to one side, and it's very easy to be skeptical about these things. But if you just put the skepticism and the doubt to one side, even for a little time, and say, okay, let me just go into this as if it's real and it's true. And you're not actually deceiving yourself, because if you want, you can go back to your doubts afterwards. They'll be there. You're not really deceiving yourself, but you're giving yourself an opportunity to see, is this something that is real? And then if it is, of course, there's huge benefit for the self and for all the others around you. because I do feel that it's that divine love coming to the soul that is the source of transformation and also of healing. And I think we all need a lot of healing, and our world needs healing. And, when we think about love, it's sometimes not so easy to understand what love is, even. And I was recently in a dialogue with somebody who is an Indigenous elder, and he described that there isn't really a word for love in Indigenous languages, but love is something that you practice. And the word he used was generosity. And so when I think about God's love, yes, it's a beautiful feeling, but what does it do for me? I think about the generosity of spirit that God has to uplift me at every moment. If I just connect my thoughts to God and I open my heart, God knows every heartbeat of I, the soul. And so with that generosity, God uplifts me and gives me what it is that I need within. And the other word that comes to me in terms of the practical experience of God's love is that of protection. Because really, when I have that feeling of belonging, then it really is so that God is my protector. And even though I may go through difficult situations, maybe even illness, many things, but still there's a feeling that because of God being present in my life and because of that feeling of God's love, I'm not suffering in the same way that I might have been otherwise. And I've experienced this myself, but I've seen it in many yogis. In fact, just one example of a yogi who actually passed away just a few days ago. And she had so much love for God, and she went through a difficult time. But the nurses at the hospital, they used this word, we were enchanted by her, because there was something very special, a special energy emanating from her. So they were feeling that energy of God's love. And so in our lives, to have that energy, it does so much for us and can help us to also understand better and serve the people around us. And so when I think of that love, first I think of God's acceptance of me, no matter how I am. And that acceptance actually returns to me my self-respect and my self-dignity. And when I think about the nurture that God gives me, that gives me tremendous inner strength and courage. And when I think about the wisdom that God gives to me, then I think about that clarity that comes to the soul, that comes to me, to understand the difference between truth and falsehood, good and bad. And that's very important in life. God is truth. And so if I have a relationship with God, there's actually a great responsibility that I hold to also be the truth and to follow the path of truth, which really means being true to myself and not killing my own conscience because I want to put a good face on things. I have to stay very alert and alive, but with God's help, that's possible. And so a life with God is a very active life, but it's a life that is filled with dignity, with truth, and with self-respect and generosity of spirit. Om Shanti.